Welcome to The Writer's Dream. This is a show where writers can talk about how they write their books, how they publish their books, and how they market their books. You can find us on YouTube and you can find us on Facebook. Just search The Writer's Dream. If you have a question for me, please message me on the Facebook page. You can also check your Cablevision guide to see when The Writer's Dream is shown in your area, and it is also aired here at LTV from East Hampton to Montauk. Today's host is Jack Bilello, and he is going to be interviewing Sal Lagumina, who has written a really interesting book on the role of Italian Americans in the OSS in World War II. So, Jack.
Thank you, Linda. Yes, you know, when the Sergeant at Arms of the United States Congress walks in to the chamber to introduce the President of the United States, he usually said, "Is it my personal honor and privilege to introduce our President?" And today I can honestly say that it is my distinct honor and personal privilege to introduce our guest, Sal Lagumina. And that is because Sal is the finest historian on Italian American immigration in the entire country. And it's not a stretch to say if he's the finest historian on Italian immigration in the country, it's in the world, because in my scouring of research throughout the world, I've never found a person throughout the world who is an expert in Italian American immigration in any other country other than Sal in the United States of America. So it's great to introduce you, Sal, and welcome to The Writer's Dream. Now, Sal, your book, by the way, would you please, for our audience, give us the title of this latest entry?
All right, let me first thank you, Jack, as the host, and Linda Frank and the Writer's Dream, as well as the LTV people, for having me here. The title of the book is The Office of Strategic Services and Italian Americans, The Untold History.
And by the way, this is the one of Sal's 21 publications, whether he has written, edited, or written magazine articles. He, as I said, is prolific in this area. Now, Sal, when we get back to the role of Italian Americans in the OSS, but before we do that, I think it would be nice as a little background to indicate what the problem that Italian Americans had prior to Mussolini declaring war on the United States 4 days after Pearl Harbor. Were there questions of loyalty? Did Italian Americans tend to support Mussolini's fascist Italy in this country? Was there a question whether they would fight against Italy? And by the way, when they fought against Italy, they would be asked to fight upon relatives, in some cases very close relatives, family members. So there was a question of why did they even have to speak Italian? So can you talk about that part of the problem that Italian Americans faced?
All right. During the Mussolini years, which goes back to the 1923-24 period, throughout the 1930s, Italian Americans had to deal with, among other things, discrimination. They probably were discriminated against more seriously than any other people of European ancestry at the time. With the outbreak of war, there was the question of loyalty. The reality was that the Italian Americans constituted the largest single ethnic group in the country of an enemy nation. Moreover, some 600,000 of them had not obtained their citizenship, American citizenship, so they were technically enemy aliens with numerous restrictions on them. With the outbreak of war, the question of loyalty was out there with respect to whether they would take up arms to fight against Italy, to fight against people of their own background, their own families in many instances. And it's a kind of a two-dimensional answer to that question of loyalty. For some, they had no qualms about fighting in Italy, raining bombs upon Italian soil. And yet there were many others who expressed their displeasure at having to take up arms against Italy because many of them had relatives there, immediate relatives, parents, brothers, cousins, and so on. So it was kind of a mixed thing. So the question of loyalty came up. But in a very short period of time, it was answered resoundingly with a wonderful demonstration of loyalty and patriotism.
Very good. And Sal, could you also, I know your mom, I think, was one of those 600,000 who was considered an enemy alien at that point in time.
Yes.
And that was resolved rather quickly, thank God. But tell us about a couple of others. For example, most people would never imagine that Joe DiMaggio or Ezio Pinza. Can you tell us about these two significant people in American history?
Yes, Joe DiMaggio's parents, who also were born in Sicily, had not obtained their citizenship papers, and they were labeled enemy aliens. Among other things, it meant that the father of Joe DiMaggio could no longer fish for a living, and there were various other restrictions. They eventually did get, well, at least the mother got their citizenship papers, but the father never did. In the case of Ezio Pinza, who was a favorite Metropolitan Opera singer, his home was raided by FBI people. He was actually arrested and spent 2 weeks in jail until he was freed with the participation of people like Mayor LaGuardia. But it was a stunning, shocking experience for him to undergo that whole experience of being considered an enemy alien. Most people don't know about that aspect of the wartime experience, but it was real, and it affected many, many people.
It's a story, but when the FBI was dragging Ezio Pinza out of his house, and they just barged in and almost broke down the door and dragged him out. As they were dragging him out, there was a letter on the wall, and one of the FBI agents said, "Who's that letter written by?" And he says, "That was Giuseppe Verdi."
Yes.
And the FBI agent said, "Oh, was he a fascist friend of yours?" Not knowing that he's one of the great opera composers of all time, really. But some of our servicemen, guys like John Basilone, Don Gentili, Anthony Casamento, immediately proved their mettle, including winning our nation's highest award for valor, the Medal of Honor, and that was something. But now to the OSS. What does the OSS stand for, Sal?
The Office of Strategic Services. Let me just, by way of explaining, spying to gain intelligence about what the enemy is doing is as old as human history. You can find references in the Bible up to our own times. And in this, in the time of World War II, the United States entered the war without an overall spy agency. There were intelligence operations in various armed services and various departments, but no overall one. And in fact, the United States was dependent on the intelligence it was able to gain from the British operators. It was evident to President Franklin D. Roosevelt that it was time for the United States to develop its own intelligence agency, and that's what led him to appoint Major, he was then Major, then promoted to General, William J. Donovan, to head this agency that would devote its time, its experience, its resources to uncovering intelligence that could be used by the United States military and other allied units to defeat the Axis powers.
Yeah, Wild Bill Donovan, and his background, of course, is very, very interesting. He was very close to General Patton. He was a great athlete. Can you tell us a little bit about his background?
All right. Donovan was born of an Irish Catholic family in Buffalo, New York. was not a well-to-do family, but he went to college. He went to Columbia University. He was an excellent football player. And he was there at the same time that Franklin D. Roosevelt was at Columbia. And that's how Roosevelt learned, or first came to know about Donovan. Donovan then became a highly successful Wall Street lawyer. He was a soldier during the First World War and received a Congressional Medal of Honor for bravery. He then continued his law practice and entered politics briefly, running but not winning the election for governor of New York State. He was a Republican, which is interesting because Roosevelt was a Democrat. And with the outbreak of war, Roosevelt tapped him to develop this intelligence operation.
Interesting that unlike today, Republicans and Democrats really got along and cooperated with each other to do some really good things for the country.
Well, it was a mark of wisdom on the part of Roosevelt not to let politics interfere with what was best for the country.
You know, Sal, your book is a scholarly work. There's a plethora of bibliography notes and footnotes, but it reads like a novel. It's a very interesting, and I read it so quickly. It's the kind of a book that once you pick it up, you can't put it down. Unlike my books, once you put them down, you can't pick them up again. So that's a feather in your cap, believe me. But there's so many interesting characters in the book, people who made such marvelous contributions, and yet we know very, very little about. For example, Joe Savoldi. Can you tell us a little about this OSS agent?
Joe Savoldi was born and raised in Italy, came to this country when he was 12 years old, and joined the rest of his family who had preceded him over here. Lived in Michigan, but he was a very strong young man, and made the football team of Notre Dame University. Became an All-American in that capacity, and was there for a couple of years. And then he entered the field of wrestling and became world wrestling champion. He was one of the people that Donovan chose to do infiltration work because he already knew the Italian language. He could melt into the crowd, and he was used with a specific mission to try to connect with some naval officers who had knowledge about scientific weapons that the Navy was developing, that the Italian Navy had developed, and that the United States Navy wanted to obtain. And so he used his muscle, his resources, his knowledge about customs and dialects, and was involved in a successful operation to bring out a couple of these Italian officers and bring them to the United States.
You know, one of the fascinating things I found out in reading this novel was how surprising it was to see who actually served in the OSS. People who knew others through their careers in show business and in sports and so on, and yet they were important OSS operatives. You mentioned Mo Berg, John Ford, the great director, the actor Sterling Hayden was a OSS agent, and of course Douglas Fairbanks Jr., who was a swashbuckler of the First Order in the 1930s and 1940s. Quentin Roosevelt, the grandson of our 26th president, Teddy Roosevelt, and the son of Ted Roosevelt, who was a character who deserves a great recognition in his own right. Julia Child of cooking and chef fame. Can you tell us a little bit about some of these people?
Well, you mentioned a whole host of them. Yeah, and they, not all of them were involved in the Italian operation, but some of them were. We mentioned Savoldi before. Moberg, who was a professional baseball player, a catcher for the Boston Red Sox, who knew various languages, and in fact, he was instrumental in some of these operations to whisk out of Italy some of these scientists that could be used by the Americans to prosecute the war.
And Douglas Fairbanks Jr., I know that,
Yeah.
that was fascinating.
Well, he was involved in an operation with others to capture some islands, some of the small Italian islands that had large numbers of prisoners and that were manned by German troops. And he worked together with others like Frank Turallo and a number of others that I mentioned to actually accomplish that. They freed a number of prisoners that were put into these jails by the fascist government in Italy in its prime.
Yeah, that is an aspect I think that is also little known. Those Italian islands, like Sardinia, like Corsica, like Lipari, and so on. And there's another one, Benevento or something like that there. That not only were they prisoners held in those islands, which were freed, but they also occupied German troops that could have been used in other areas of war, which could have really made it more difficult for the Allies, the American and the British. And the OSS was very instrumental in those small little islands that very few people knew that there was some serious fighting going on. Can you tell us a little bit about the concept called black propaganda?
Yes, black propaganda was one of the techniques developed by the OSS to fool the enemy, to mislead them. For example, one of the things that OSS people did, including an Italian American who had a printing background from Chicago, to make up fake letters, fake German stamps, and with letters indicating misinformation that was planted in situations where the German troops would pick these up, and these would be regarded by the German officers as true, but they really were misleading. And they did a remarkable job in that connection to mislead Germans. It was they were very resourceful, planting these things where German troops who occupied much of Italy, especially late in the war, and it was a successful operation, very much so.
How did the OSS recruit these really heroic and little known? Some of them couldn't talk about their experiences to this day. Some have waited 60 years.
Exactly.
And you interviewed, you knew Max Corvo,
yes.
You knew Frank Turallo.
Right.
And
right.
they never revealed their experiences until way
much,
after the war was over.
Yes.
So how did the OSS actually recruit, and then what was some of the important training that they had to undergo?
Okay, yes, the recruitment took the form of the Army, or rather the OSS, looking for people already in the service, such as the Army, who had already been indoctrinated in at least part of the military activity. And these people then were invited to apply to become members of the OSS. Not all of them made it, incidentally. The OSS was very careful in recruiting. They wanted the right kind of personnel, the people who were really willing to put their lives on the line, because for many of them it meant infiltrating behind enemy lines, which already is dangerous, and the possibility of being captured was also very real. Incidentally, once they were recruited, they had to undergo a tremendous amount of training, military type of training, learning how to make bombs, how to plant them in vulnerable places, how to set them off, etc. And when I think about it, I should mention that when people were recruited into the OSS, they were not to use their real names. Now, with celebrities like Joe Savoldi, they all knew who he was, but they all had nicknames.
Or code names.
Code
Yeah,
names,
yeah.
exactly, in order so that they would not be apprehended for the real persons that they might have been. So the recruitment involved exercises, military exercises, to be able to stay out in the field and live off the land. So it was a rigorous kind of training. And as I said, not all of them would be able to make it.
And you can almost imagine a parachute drop in the dead of night behind German
Enemy
lines.
line, right?
You can imagine rowing in a rubber raft onto a hostile shore, not knowing what was waiting for them on the shore. These were incredible men. And so many of them are anonymous to us. And in your book, you reveal so many names that I had never heard of. And unfortunately, there are so many that we cannot really go through all in the time that we have available to us. But some, I think, deserve special recognition. Max Corvo. Can you tell us a little bit about Max Corvo?
Yes, I think above all the other names that I mentioned there, he is the one that I would like for people to remember. Max Corvo was a young 21-year-old Italian American who was born in Sicily, came to live and work in Middletown, Connecticut. His father had to flee Sicily because he was anti-Mussolini. In Middletown, they developed an Italian language newspaper called the Bollettino, which eventually was changed to the Bulletin. Max Corvo worked with his father in putting out this newspaper. Never finished high school. With the outbreak of war, he went into the U.S. Army, he volunteered, and he focused on developing a map on his own, a topographical map of Sicily, which he knew very well, and got his superior officers to become interested in this, and this then led to bringing this knowledge of the map, which included harbors,
topography,
yeah,
right?
Exactly.
Very accurate.
This was brought to the attention of top brass in the United States Army, who didn't have up-to-date maps about Sicily.
So this,
And Sicily was important because once the Allied forces took over and defeated the Axis powers in North Africa, the first place on the mainland to be invaded was Sicily. And what they did in Sicily would serve as a kind of a template for other invasions of other parts of Western Europe. So it was an important operation. And for them to do it properly was extremely important.
yeah, I think that's something that we should recognize, that, before we had the army and the leadership to invade Northwest Europe, which turns out to be June 6, 1944, Omaha Beach in Normandy, Utah Beach, we had to develop and train a fighting, ruthless army with ruthless leaders like Eisenhower and Mark Clark and Lucien Truscott and all the others, that we had to use these as training grounds in order to prepare, because at the beginning of the war, we were not prepared.
Exactly.
Really, Eisenhower had never even led a platoon or a squad in actual combat. So the invasion of Sicily and the OSS was very, very important in the success of the invasion of Sicily. And I think that's something that is little known.
Right. In fact, the invasion of Sicily went under the code name of Operation Husky. It was up to at that point, that invasion was the largest amphibious invasion in history, and it served as a lesson as to what would work in the D-Day invasion of Western Europe, as you mentioned before, on June 6, 1944.
Can you tell us a little bit about a very controversial, well, before we even do that, there's a fascinating story about someone that you knew. I believe he was a student of yours.
Yes.
His name was Frank Turallo. Can you tell us a little bit about that and that 6 degree of separation story that happened to him when he was underground and moved into Italy?
Right. He was another product of Middletown, Connecticut, who was a fine man. I was privileged to have him in my class as a student when I taught in Middletown. He was part of the landing forces that invaded Sicily, and they achieved success fairly rapidly, and then he was able to get a 2-day pass to go and visit his relatives. He had grandparents and other members of his family living in eastern Sicily. And so he and another buddy got into a Jeep with all kinds of packages for their relatives and drove to this little town.
Mileli, I think it was called. Mileli.
Mileli, yes, Mileli, right. And as he approached the town, he saw a little old man sitting in a chair with a book in his hand. And he approached him. It turned out to be Frank Turallo's grandfather, who had the high school book of the Middletown High School with Frank's picture there. How the grandfather knew that the grandson was coming, it's a mystery.
He said in Italian, figlio mio.
Yeah, exactly.
That's marvelous.
It's incredible.
An absolutely marvelous story. And we're wrapping up. I would want you to, the controversial contribution of Lucky Luciano, who was the notorious mafia leader in this country, was deported to Sicily. Did he have any role in the OSS and the success of America's operations?
I asked that specifically of Max Corvo, who was the overall OSS director for Sicily, and all of Italy, I should say. And he was adamant in his denial that they used Luciano. He said, no way, he didn't. He did not want any part of it. But it's very possible that the Naval Intelligence Service used Luciano.
Well, Sal, we're just about wrapping up. Unfortunately, this, when you're having a good time, it flies. And I'm just hoping that Linda finds it in the goodness of her heart to make this part 1 of this interview so that we can carry on, because there's so much more. But I want to thank you for a fascinating half hour. I know I was thoroughly enjoyed. I enjoyed your book thoroughly, and I would recommend it as high as I could recommend any book that I've ever written.
Thank you very much, Jack. It was a pleasure to be here.